Now on Radio 4, in the final part of his series examining how you pay for the city, David Grossman investigates how the city has benefited from government intervention since the crisis of 2008. And he examines the cost to consumers of the increased speculation in commodities that followed.
Throughout this series, we've seen how the banks and financial institutions make money out of our pensions and savings, and how the ever-expanding complexity and layers of the system mean that we are paying for the profits, pay and bonuses of the city. As economist and author Professor John Kay put it to me at the start of this investigation,
everything that anyone in the city earns is ultimately money that is made by someone in the non-financial economy, either you and me as savers or the companies that we work for or that produce the goods and services we buy.
In the final instalment of this sometimes shocking story, we'll see how the desperate measures the government has taken to save us from the mess caused in part by the banks has actually ended up putting more money in the pockets of the bankers.
QE has actually been responsible for an extraordinary economic redistribution upwards. It's quite shocking in a sense that there's not been more objection to this.
And how, on the back of this government intervention, the banks have found new and sometimes scary ways to make money.
If this should lead to the kind of bubble we found in 2008, and there are serious losses as a result of this gambling, who's going to end up paying to sustain the banks? Well, the history was it was the taxpayers.
If you're a saver, perhaps you have a weekend ritual. Cup of tea and the weekend papers. Flip to the money section and check out the best buy tables. Oh, if you do, you kind of fail to notice that this is perhaps one of the worst times in the whole history of ever to be a saver. In this series, we're looking at how you, we, all of us, pay for the city, and these pitiful rates here in black and white are another cost that savers are paying. Sylvia Waycott of Money Facts, which compiles the best buy tables, says that banks are competing with each other to offer the worst rates for savers.
It's been quite strange. We've had a history of 25 years at Money Facts where all of the providers have constantly been trying to get to the top of the savings, and they'd ring up and they'll say, are we the top? Who's the top? Really, really excited, really anxious. They would design products to make sure they was at the top. And for the first time ever, we had people not wanting to be in the top. They didn't want to be in the chart.
Well, why wouldn't they want to be in the chart?
They wouldn't want to be in the Best Buy chart because they didn't want to be offering the best rates. Right. They wanted to be offering a more conservative rate, so they would lower their rates.
So the banks are paying dreadful rates because they don't want your money. What sort of weird world is this? The reason, says Sylvia, is that the government now guarantees banks cheap funds through a scheme called Funding for Lending.
Because the government's come in and said, borrow from us at a really cheap rate, they've suddenly said, we don't need savers' money anymore, thanks very much. And so savers' rates on all of the accounts have absolutely plummeted to the average for a no-notice account is 0.71%, which is lower than inflation. And then if you're a taxpayer, you'd be sharing that with the taxman as well. So really quite rubbish rates, actually.
Because the government is helping the banks with cheap money, savers get less. According to Simon Rose from the pressure group Save Our Savers, this represents an entirely improper seizure of savers' assets. And he says the rates offered by savers by the banks are being kept artificially low in part because the base rate set by the Bank of England is itself so low.
You can actually see the real price of money in other places. Now, they've decided it should just be 0.5%. But if you look at the peer-to-peer market, for instance, which matches off people who want to borrow against people who want to lend money, well, there the rate's sort of 5%, roughly. Well, that is simply people coming together and saying, I'm going to lend some money, what will you pay me? Or I need to borrow money, how much does it cost? That is free market capitalism operating, not the sort of crony capitalism with the sort of Stalinist control of the price of money that we get from the Bank of England. People never seem to challenge the idea that the Bank of England should set the price of money, but I find it very bizarre that they do, particularly when we're seeing the cost of their decisions.
But while savings rates are ultra low, a quick scan through the best buy tables in the newspapers suggests that, well, this isn't an especially cheap time to be a borrower. The difference between the rates at which banks lend and borrow is where they make their profit. It's called the spread, and now seems to be a particularly lucrative time. But if the banks are getting cheap money through funding for lending, at least they're passing it on in lending. Well, yes and no. The team at Moneyfacts track the number and type of mortgages on the market. Sylvia Waycott has compared where we are now with the spring of 2009, before the government began its interventions, of which funding for lending is perhaps the most recent and arguably the most significant. She says that although there are more mortgages on offer now, they are very much targeted at the wealthy, not the struggling.
If you had a 40% deposit in March 2009, there was 272 different mortgage products that you could have chose from to take your mortgage. As soon as funding for lending came in, it rose to 472, and it's now 544.
It's basically doubled.
Yeah, that market is the market that the banks and building societies are feeling most secure in. If you're a first-time buyer and looking for a 95% mortgage in March 2009, there was only 3 on the market that you could choose from. Now there are 54.
They've gone from non-existent, virtually non-existent, to scarce.
Yes.
So the funding for lending scheme seems to be helping the rich remortgage rather than, say, first-time buyers. And the banks don't have to lend out the money at all. True, if they didn't, they would be fined, but some suggest that the fines are set so low as to be no deterrent at all to the banks. They can simply take the funding for lending money and not lend it out. We've switched locations to the heart of the City of London and right outside the Bank of England. And if you could see financial flows in real terms and not just sort of signals, electronic signals down a wire, you would see money flying out of the building opposite me, which is the Bank of England. With me is independent banking analyst, commentator, blogger Francis Coppola. Let's think about funding for lending for a moment. Let's start with a name. Is that the right name for it?
I don't think it is.
What should it be called?
Funding for lending is just funding, really. Certainly in the first round of it, I think it was evident from the results that in a few very high-profile cases, what the banks had actually done was just taken the cheap money and then not lent. And actually, I had a look at the figures for this, and it was fairly evident that a bank that was facing high funding costs at that time, which at the time funding for lending was introduced, a lot of banks were, could actually benefit from taking the cheap money and then not lending. They'd face a penalty, but the penalty was actually less than the funding costs would have been.
Funding for lending has had the most obvious and direct impact on savers and borrowers, but there has been a far bigger government scheme that has had, some believe, far more impact, albeit in less obvious ways.
The interest rate has been cut again and now stands at an all-time low of 0.5%. And the Bank of England is for the first time going to start creating new money, £75 billion worth.
When the Bank of England began its huge, unprecedented programme of quantitative easing, the government told us it was necessary to stop the economy collapsing altogether. What they were less clear on was how this policy of creating money would make the rich, and rich bankers in particular, even richer.
It is a huge amount of money. We are talking billions. The QE programme, I think, currently stands at 375 billion of asset purchases, so that's 375 billion of new money, roughly, that's gone supposedly out into the economy. But I think the way in which that works is a little bit confusing for people, because what it's not gone into directly is into companies, to households, to help them to pay their bills, to generate new activity in the economy. It's gone primarily, in the first instance, to people who held financial assets, to people who had government securities, which the bank bought back in return for new money, and that money then found its way into banks. And it's increased what we call reserves, which is the money that banks use to back lending.
So QE has made the banks more secure and allowed them to make money lending. But there has been another big earner for the banks from the way that QE works. The Bank of England creates money and uses it to buy Treasury bonds known as gilts. But they don't go straight to the Treasury to get them. They buy ones that have already been purchased by financial institutions who, surprise, surprise, make a profit on the deal. Here's Francis Coppola.
Banks actually held gilts themselves. In the first round of QE, the Bank of England tried not to buy gilts from banks, but in subsequent rounds it has bought from banks, and the banks have made a profit on the sales of those gilts because of the increase in asset prices.
So, to recap, QE, the mechanism that the government came up with to save us from the mess of the financial collapse, has actually ended up increasing the earnings of the banks. Simon Rose of the Save Our Savers campaign is not impressed.
The Bank of England's own figures on the early stages of QE pointed out that what QE essentially is a transfer of wealth. You can't create wealth by printing money, which is essentially what QE is. What you can do is redistribute it. And QE has actually been responsible for an extraordinary economic redistribution upwards. It's quite shocking in a sense that there's not been more objection to this. I think the main problem is that people hear the words quantitative easing and they virtually fall asleep.
Of course, the Bank of England would say we can't possibly know how much worse things might have been for us all had they not resorted to QE. That is probably not much comfort for people about to retire. The low interest rates and high gilt prices caused by the government's actions have led to very low annuity rates. That's the income that someone can purchase to cover their retirement. Pensions expert Richard Eagling explains.
If you're looking at someone who was hitting retirement, we'll take a male, age 65, that's a good benchmark. Someone who hit retirement back in March 2009, for every £10,000 of pension pot they had, that was delivering £665 a year. What you're looking at now, in June, is the equivalent of £502 a year. So you're looking at a fall of £160 odd pounds, sort of roughly speaking, for every £10,000 of your pension pot, which works out about percentage-wise about a 25% fall in the income that you would be getting. So that's in the space of just over sort of 4 years. That's a very big drop.
The Bank of England says that these low annuity rates are offset by the support that QE has given to assets like shares that pension funds are invested in. So while someone retiring might get less annuity for their money, they actually have more money in their pension with which to purchase that annuity. But that brings us on to one of the dangers with QE that worried banks and investors, that it would lead to inflation. To protect against this, investors piled into commodities like oil and metals. The logic being, if you buy an ounce of gold and inflation pushes up prices, well, the price of your ounce of gold will have risen too. Commodities were already booming, but now so much money has rushed in, we've ended up with another bubble. Professor Michael Greenberger is an economist and former market regulator.
For years and years, there was never disruption in the commodity markets to this extent that the price of the commodity was unmoored from supply-demand fundamentals. What we see today is that the markets are completely unmoored from supply-demand fundamentals.
The cause, says Professor Greenberger, is a huge rise in the number of speculators. But the market regulators are specifically charged with preventing an excessive level of speculation. So what's gone wrong? Well, in 2003, following intense lobbying, regulators allowed the big merchant banks to be classed as commercial market participants rather than speculators. The result, says Professor Greenberger, has been disastrous.
Roughly in these markets, there's now 70 to 80% speculation and 20 to 30% commercial. That is, the markets have absolutely flipped on their head. And the market now is not a commercial hedging market. It's a casino for people to bet on the price direction of the commodities.
Remember, this speculation is in commodities that we all need, like fuel and food, which means if vast profits are being made, it's the rest of us who pay. I'm on my way to a petrol station to meet a motoring journalist who's been investigating this. Hopefully we can fill up on his knowledge. And here we are, and oh, hello. Hello. We've got a very overqualified petrol attendant here, Quentin Wilson, the motoring journalist and presenter. Oh yeah, diesel please, thank you very much. What has happened to oil prices, petrol prices, since the big crash?
2008 to 9, oil went from a peak of $147 to $35 and then back to $80. And we said, look, where is the supply and demand there? And you've got the global economy on its knees, and demand from China and the US and Europe is down, yet we still saw these really, really significant spikes in the price of oil. And it wasn't geopolitical, it wasn't because we'd got to peak oil, it was purely because people were speculating on oil and making money out of it and forcing the prices up unnaturally.
How damaging is this, that something so vital as the price of oil is used as a kind of a counter in a game of gambling?
It's one of the most important commodities we have. It is embedded in the price of absolutely everything we do and buy. We have a road economy here, they have a road economy in the States. High oil, high diesel means higher prices in the supermarkets. And it's being manipulated by a small cartel of people. The global economy is being risked, and future growth and future prosperity and the wealth of families and businesses being affected by oil speculation.
However, not everyone agrees that this is what caused commodity price hikes. Jeffrey Harris was chief economist at the US regulator, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, during the 2008 oil price spike and looked very hard at the data for signs of manipulation.
We didn't see any particular group of traders or individual trader trying to push the market around. We saw broad-based buying among all participants. We could, I think, very definitively say that we could look at the long and short positions of hedge funds and other financial traders that would be deemed speculators and suggest that there wasn't a big run-up in price.
Ah, a refreshing can of soft drink. Do feel free to join me, or perhaps you'd rather have a beer. It might surprise you to know that every time you chug back a cold one, you could be putting a bit more money in the pockets of the banks. Since 2003, the law in the US changed to allow the banks to not just deal in so-called paper commodities, options and futures contracts, but actually deal in physical products. So the banks now own mines and pipelines and refineries and tankers and trucks and warehouses, including warehouses for aluminium. Aluminium like this can is made out of. Cheers. Last month, the US Senate Banking Committee began an investigation into banks owning and trading physical commodities. In written evidence to the committee, the US brewing giant Miller Coors said they believed the bank's activities were costing consumers $3 billion a year in higher costing drinks cans. The company told the committee,
"Aluminum prices in general, and for canned sheet in particular, have remained inflated relative to the massive oversupply and record production. What's supposed to happen under these economic conditions? When supplies rise, while demand is flat to down, prices should fall. Instead, what's happening is that the aluminum we are purchasing is being held up in warehouses controlled and owned by U.S. bank holding companies."
Former commodities regulator Professor Michael Greenberger says that this combination of physical and paper commodity trading has led to a bonanza of profits for the banks.
The big banks are the sponsors of the casino. They've essentially opened up a casino. They don't care where the price goes. They're hedged. So they're making money on the transactions, and they're making hundreds of millions of dollars on those transactions. The next thing they discovered is, well, we should own the underlying commodities. Banks, to be bank holding companies protected by the Fed window, have to be in the banking business. And now the Federal Reserve has asked the question, if you own commodities and bet on commodities as a bank who's entitled to a bailout if you fail, are you in the banking business to that extent? To the average person on the street, they would say that's not what banks are supposed to do.
Banks getting their corporate hands dirty in the production and distribution of the physical commodities they trade in can give them valuable inside information, which is not illegal, as it would be if they were insider dealing in shares, but it can be just as lucrative for the banks, but not for the pension funds and investors. And there's another reason why investors like pension funds should be wary of getting involved in commodities and why banks can make big money from this trade. Now, imagine I'm a would-be investor. I've heard this buzz about commodities and I'd quite like a slice of the action. I can't just really go out and buy copper or aluminium. For a start, where would I put it? So what can I do? Well, the way to get into commodities is to buy a commodities fund. And these are funds like ETFs or exchange-traded funds, for example. They're set up by banks to track something like the FTSE 100 share index or the price of copper or the price of a basket of commodities. And to do this, the banks buy not the commodities itself, but a futures contract on that commodity. And you'll remember, futures contracts are for the delivery of a certain quantity at a certain price on a certain date. So to maintain the fund, the bank has to keep rolling its futures contracts, selling the ones that are getting close to delivery and buying longer dated ones.
It's something that does not lend itself to being easily and quickly understood. But once you do understand it, it really is the key to unlocking many, many aspects of how damaging this whole investment process is.
David Frank from the campaign group Better Market says the key points to remember are that the funds have to renew their futures contracts and that the market knows in advance on which days this will happen.
For 5 days every month, you have to roll from the old contract into the new contract. Futures contracts expire, so you have to replace the expiring one with a longer dated one. So when that 5-day window comes around each month, you go ahead and you sell your existing position and you buy a longer dated position. Well, as any trader knows, if somebody is in the pit signaling their intentions, then they're going to get a terrible deal.
So essentially you've got a series of customers and the people doing the buying and selling know they have to be active and they're able to adjust their prices accordingly. They know that these participants have no choice but to do that, and therefore they can take positions against them.
That's exactly right. And the banks are no slouches, and so they recognized that there was a danger of that happening. I think they probably did not predict the extent to which it would happen. So as a result, they wrote into their agreements with the pension funds that when that happened, the pension funds would always foot the bill.
And it gets worse or better if you happen to be lucky enough to be a bank.
Suppose that you're a bank who's doing this kind of product for your customers. You know that on those 5 days, you're going to get ripped off. You don't really care because actually the pension fund's paying for it anyway, but why not get a better deal and then you actually get to keep whatever profit you make from getting a better deal. So this is one of the reasons why these large investment banks have actually entered into commodities in a much broader way, so that they can get as much information as possible and as many avenues as possible through which to trade commodities. Meaning that when the 5-day roll window comes along, nowadays they're not even trading during those 5 days. They're already done. So in reality, what you now have is a lot of large banks essentially treating the commodity markets like a casino throughout most of the month, and then during that 5-day roll window, they're not even getting the bad deal that the pension funds are paying for.
This is yet another example of how, no matter what happens, the banks have found a way of making money in a process that many argue serves no purpose at all for the rest of us. Meanwhile, it's time to settle our bill, the bill that is at the petrol station. And while we queue for the £5 or so fuel our budget would stretch to, journalist and Fair Fuel campaigner Quentin Wilson tells me too many people are suffering because of the actions of the commodity speculators.
It needs somebody to actually say, right, we need to look at this, we need transparency, we need fairness, we need a proper system of price reporting, and it needs to stand absolute scrutiny. At the moment, this is a trillion dollar casino. Call me old-fashioned, but we need something better than that.
And here we are, we're going to get the bill. Pump 2, please. Yeah. How much of what we're paying now is, do you think, going into speculators' pockets?
I really wish I knew, but I would say a conservative estimate would be about 20%.
We couldn't have it for £1 off, could we?
The panel. I wish I could give it to you.
Thanks very much. Just as the rise in commodities was accelerated by quantitative easing, now that the US Federal Reserve has hinted that policy might be coming to an end, so commodity prices have slipped back. This world, though, is vast and lucrative, and it's one we all pay for. And Professor Michael Greenberger believes it could yet cost us infinitely more.
This, again, is another risky business the banks are in. While they're winning the bets, they take home the profits. If this should lead to the kind of bubble we found in 2008, and there are serious losses as a result of this gambling, who's going to end up paying to sustain the banks? Well, the history was in 2008, it was the taxpayers.
The reporter of How You Pay for the City was David Grossman. The programme was produced by Phil Kemp.